In 1158, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra found himself disturbed by a provocative dream. This dream ultimately inspired him to author a treatise concerning the proper time of the halachic day, the proper time of Shabbos, and that is evening. One possibility is that this work was a polemical discourse aimed at Rashbam's Torah commentary. This prompts us to look closely into the story of Rashbam's commentary, examining some of the controversial passages that have sparked confusion throughout the ages. Ultimately, we emerge from this exploration with an empowering revelation. The fact that the halachic day commences at nightfall teaches us about becoming resilient in times of crisis. In the year 1168, the Jews of Yemen were facing a very severe crisis. There was an Islamic cleric who took over the rulership of the country at the time and basically issued an edict that all Jews need to convert to Islam. And this obviously caused all types of problems for the Jewish community there. In addition to that, there was a Jew who was very charismatic and who converted and who said that this guy is right and everyone indeed has to convert, and he was having a significant influence on the population. There was also a Jew within the Jewish community who arose and said that he's Mashiach at the time. This all happened in the span of a few months. You can understand the Jewish community in Yemen was very bewildered and pained by all of this. They turned to the Rambam for guidance, and this is the background of the Rambam's famous Igeres Teiman. There's one passage from this long letter. There are many important points that are raised in this letter. But because this is serving as a general introduction to what we're going to talk about, we're only going to touch on one point here. Says the Rambam as follows to them. Hashem already promised to Yaakov that although other nations are going to persecute his progeny, and will torture them, and in fact will be stronger than the Jewish people at times, nonetheless, the Jewish people yisharu v'yamdu, they will remain, they will survive and thrive. And those who persecute the Jews will pass away and be destroyed. Where do we have a remez that this is being told to Yaakov Avinu? K'may shenemar on the pasuk that we said a few times on Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah, and your children will be like the dust of the earth. What is the meaning that your children, the Jewish people, will be like the dust of the earth? So the most obvious explanation that we're used to hearing is that we'll be as numerous as the dust of the earth or the sand at the sea. However, Zak the Rambam, a different interpretation, Koloimar, afal pi sheim nesuim lemirmos ulemirpas ka'afar hazeh sha'akel derzen. The Jews will be like dirt in the sense that, yes, there will be those who will trample upon us just as people trample over the dirt. Nonetheless, soif sheyigbaru v'yanatzchu. At the end, the Jewish people will prevail. They will overcome their enemies. And that too is indicated by dust. How so? V'chein al derech hamashol k'moisha ha'afar ba'acharisa yala al hadarsim oisoi v'yisharhu. Because at the end of the day, people are buried in the ground. That is, they are defeated by the dust. The dust rises above them. The person falls under the dust. And that's going, and so although throughout his lifetime a person may trample upon the dust, in the end the dust has the last say. And in the same way, although it is true that there are those who are going to persecute the Jewish people, but the Jewish people are going to, in the end, prevail. This you can understand how the Jewish community in Yemen would have taken solace by hearing these comforting words from the Rambam, amongst the many other points that he has in his letter. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to connect this idea to another idea that relates to this week's parsha, but it's going to take some time for us to get there. We're going to have to do a lot of background work. So let's put this aside for now, and let's begin another subject. The Ibn Ezra, sometimes he's called Ibn Ezra, right, if it's you're using the Spanish pronunciation, which means he's from the Ezra family, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. His dates are roughly from 1089 to 1164, so he's one of the earlier Rishonim. He's most well known for his commentaries to the Torah. However, in addition to the commentaries on the Torah, he wrote numerous other works. and one of them is known as Igeras HaShabbos. What is Igeras HaShabbos? He writes an introduction to Igeras HaShabbos, so let's have a read what he says in this introduction. Vayhi bishnas arba'as halafim v'tchameas v'tcha esrei shana. It was 4,000 years, 900 years, and 19 years. If don't take off your socks and shoes to count, I'll do it for you. It comes out to the year 1158. B'chatzi leil Shabbos, it was midnight on Friday night. Ba'arba sayom l'chodesh Teves, on Yodalet Teves, it comes out to December of 1158. V'ani Avraham Hasfardi, Hanikra ibn Ezra, I Avraham from the Iberian Peninsula. Hayisi be'ir achas me'orei ha'i hanikra ksei aretz. I was in one of the cities on the island that is known as the end of the earth. Shehu begvul hashvi megvulos aretz hanashavas, which is at the seventh boundary of the inhabited world. This is a phrase that was used, or a demarcation that was used by when people were doing geography in this day. They divided the inhabited world that they know of into 7 different zones, and this is in the 7th zone. He calls it Ksei Ha'aretz, and from this description here, and as well from other sources, we know that he's referring to the country of England. At the time, in the 12th century, there was a Jewish community in England, and we also know that Ibn Ezra traveled rather widely, and so he's in England in December of 1158. This is the last few years of his life. And he says, V'ani oyisi yashen v'shinasi arvoli, or arvoli. My sleep was sweet for me. In other words, he was engaged in a gute shlaf. V'era b'chaloim, suddenly I had a dream. V'hine oimed lenegdi kamara gever, I see a man, uv'yode egeres chasuma, and he has a sealed letter. Payan v'yomer elai, and the man told me, kach zois ha'egeres, take this letter, shesholcha elecha Shabbos, because it was sent to you by Shabbos. Shabbos, the day of the week, has sent you a letter. V'hi zois, and this is what the letter says. We're not going to read the whole letter. We'll read, the opening line is like this. Ani Shabbos, I am Shabbos, ateres das, the crown of Judaism, yikarim, for the Tayir Yid. Revi'is ba'aseres hadvarim, the 4th of Aseres hadibris. Udvein Hashem, uvein banav, and between Hashem and the Jewish people, ani ois bris oilam, I am an eternal covenant, l'chol doiros v'doirim, for all future generations. If these words are somewhat familiar to you, it's when I was a child, there was a tape that came out from Mordechai and David that had this as a song. If we had the time, I'd sing it to you, but we don't, so we're going to continue. Anyway, it goes on. Shabbos is talking all about himself, line after line after line, about how special he is, or she is. And then, toward the end of this letter, it says, Biziknascha shchaga nimtza vach. In your old age, an error has happened to you. Remember, this is the last 10 years or so of Ibn Ezra's life, so he's in his old age. Asher huvu elei veischa svarim, books have been brought into your home. V'sham kasav lachalo leil shvi, and there it says that you should desecrate, not keep Shabbos. Va'ikat, so I wake up, v'tispoim ruchi alai, and I got very nervous. V'nafshi nefalamoid, I was confused. V'akum v'chamasi ba'aravi, and now I got out of bed, and now I'm angry. V'elbash b'gadi v'erchat yadi, I put on my clothes, and I washed my hands. V'oitzi chutza hasvarim alei l'ravana, he pulls out his entire library, it sounds like, to the chutzner, to start finding this book that says that he should desecrate Shabbos. V'hinei sham kasu pirish v'yerev v'yibayker, and finally he finds the book. He doesn't tell us how long it took him. And he finds a book that says on the pasuk Vayerev V'yibayker that we have in this week's parasha, Parashas Bereshis, V'oimer, and it says in this book as follows: Kasher hoya boiker yoim sheni, when you had the second morning, az Allah yoim echad shalem, that's when you had a complete day. Ki halayla hoylach achar yoim, because the night follows the day. So you needed to wait till you had the second day. Then you're like, oh, we had a day yesterday, and we had a night last night. Now we started the morning, so now we can look back and say we had a day. In other words, what is the day according to this interpretation? The day begins by day. Sorry for the double meaning of the word day. But what is the yom? The yom is a day followed by the night. That's obviously not how we observe Shabbos. We observe Shabbos with the night preceding the day. Uchamat kot, karati bigdi, v'gam karati ze apirish. I was about to rend my clothing and to tear this book. Ki amarti, because I said, it's a iser, at least on some level, to tear. Toiv lechalo Shabbos achas v'lo yechalu Yisrael Shabbos es harbe. Better to be mechalo one Shabbos and not to help avoid Jews desecrating many a Shabbos. If people are going to be exposed to this interpretation. Indeed, we will be a mocking in the eyes of the Arelim. Arelim here means Christians. Remember that Muslims have a bris. So the Christians are going to laugh at us for interpreting the verse in this way. What does it mean the Christians are going to laugh at us for interpreting the verse this way? So I'm not an expert in Christianity, but definitely at some point they interpreted the start of their Sabbath to begin at sunset, and then at a certain point it transitioned over to midnight. I'm not entirely sure when that transition happened and whether it happened by this time or not, but either way, whether they held sunset or whether they had midnight, that's when they held it began. They didn't hold it began by morning, and so therefore he's also concerned of Ma Yoimru HaGoyim. Vas apek ba'avur kvoid HaShabbos. But nonetheless, I held myself in, and I didn't tear my clothing, and I didn't tear this book. But I did make a promise and a pledge that right after Shabbos, I will compose a work to explain when the day is supposed to begin according to the Torah. This is the introduction to this work. He then goes on to explain different elements of the Jewish calendar with a focus on the fact that the year and the month and the new day all begin at night, never during the day. This work from Ibn Ezra was not printed until very, very late. I don't remember right now if it was, I think sometime the 1700s, but I don't remember right now the exact date when it was published. But it did exist in manuscript, and we have manuscripts that have this going back to the 1500s. No really older ones, but it's obviously the one manuscript was copying another manuscript, and there's every reason to believe that indeed this came from the Ibn Ezra. In fact, there's allusions to this in his that he was concerned about this issue in his commentary to Shmois Perek Tazayim Pasuk Chaf Hey. So let's have a read of what he says over there. Rabim Chasrei Amuna Yishtabshu Bavur Zah Pasuk. Many people who are lacking in faith got messed up because of this pasuk. We'll see which pasuk in a second. Va'amru and said, Ki chayav adam lishmar yom haShabbos va'alayla ba'acharav. They say Shabbos begins by the morning and Motzei Shabbos. Ki Moshe Amar, what pasuk? Where do they derive this? Ki Moshe Amar, Ki Shabbos hayom la'Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu Parshas B'Shalach, when he's saying, I know man fell today, Shabbos hayom la'Hashem. Why do you say hayom la'Hashem? Shabbos hayom la'Hashem. Today is Shabbos, implying v'lo alayla sha'avar. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say last night was already Shabbos, and so therefore they derive from here that Shabbos begins in the morning. Gam Amar Machar. Another thing is that when he was talking to them that there's no man that's going to fall tomorrow, he said, no one that's going to fall tomorrow. Another Shabbos Hayoim Machar is the language that he used. And this was a conversation that happened on Friday when they said, why is there a double portion of month today? Ki Shabbos Hayoim Machar, implying that he didn't say Shabbos Hayoim Haim by Nacht. And so therefore this is another piece of evidence that they brought. Then Ibn Ezra says, and indeed, they find their way in this pasuk Vayera Vayibayker, just like in the book that he found in his house in England in 1158, where it interprets Vayera Vayibayker in this way, where in whichever way it's not so negay right now, but in one way or another they interpreted this verse to mean that only when you reach the second Boiker, the second day, then you can look back and say, we had a day followed by a night, and now we had a complete day. However, this is incorrect. When Moshe Rabbeinu was talking to them about Shabbos, and he was saying Shabbos is the day, and don't cook during the day of Shabbos and all of that, he was talking about what was common for them. And here the Ibn Ezra says something interesting. The Christian lands, the customs are different from the way it is done in Eretz Yisrael or in the Middle East. B'ma'acholam, in terms of the eating mannerisms, uv'mabusham, how they dress, uvinyanam, how they construct buildings, v'inyanam, and generally their social life, or their life in general. Why is this relevant to point out? Ki ein minig sheyefa adam yavashal bekayis uv'chayrev v'loy lases malacha rak b'yoyim. In Eretz Yisrael and in the Middle East, it is completely unheard of for people to do cooking, baking, or any form of work, not in the summer and not in the winter, during the nighttime. And so therefore Moshe Rabbeinu was going to tell them, here, don't cook and don't bake, and don't do it. It wasn't a get to them. They're in the desert, and they're in the vicinity of Eretz Yisrael. The custom was to do all their cooking and baking, even in the winter, when the days are shorter. And so there's maybe more of a need to do something in nighttime hours. Nonetheless, this is not the custom. And so don't get carried away by living in a Christian land. And when you live in a Christian land, you can't assume that this is the interpretation because it's like Balacha is done by day and by night. No. when you recognize that that was the historical context behind this pasuk, then you'll understand that that's why Moshe Rabbeinu said it the way it was. And so don't impose your European manners on the reality that was there in the Torah. And this is how he explains this particular passage in Parshas Beshalach. Okay, that's why it says tomorrow. So anyway, it seems that at least in Christian lands, it was common for people to bake during the 12th century, to bake, to cook, at least in the winter when the days were shorter. This was probably done, and this is what Ibn Ezra is referring to. He then goes on to say that their interpretation of Vayera Vayibaker is wrong, just as he does in his Igeras HaShabbos, where he goes on and on to explain that point. He does the same thing here in his commentary to Shmos in Perek Tes Zayin. And now the question we need to address is, so who is Ibn Ezra talking about? We have the Igeras HaShabbos, we have his commentary in Shmos. He's talking about people who are being Mechalel Shabbos because they're not keeping the halachic Shabbos. Who is he referring to? So one option, we turn to the travelogue of Rabbi Binyamin of Tadella. Rabbi Binyamin of Tadella, I believe we mentioned him in a previous class a few months ago. He was born in Tadella, which is an area in Navarre that's on the Iberian Peninsula. Today it's part of Spain. He went out to travel in the year 1165 and wrote a travelogue. It was published for the first time in the year 1543 in Constantinople. In this work, he describes Umisham, from the prior place where he was, Arba Yamim leKurfus, 4 days travel to Cyprus. V'sham Yehudim Rabbanim Ukraim. There are Jews, both Rabbinites and Karaites, and the Karaites is the medieval Jewish community that rejected Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, so there's a mix there, both in Cyprus, both of Rabbanim, those who follow halacha and those who don't. But then he says there's a third class of Jews, V'oicham Yehudim Minim Nikraim Epikursim. I guess the locals there call them Epikursim. V'Yisrael Menadinoisam B'chol Makom, and the Jews have excommunicated them in all places. Whether that means all places in Cyprus or all places beyond Cyprus is not clear to me. V'hemachalel leil Shabbos, they desecrate Friday night. V'shoimrim leil Rishon Motzai Shabbos, and they observe leil Sunday night. The night that we early Yom Rishon, what we call Motzai Shabbos, they observe. So this is from around the time of Ibn Ezra. Remember, 1158 is when Ibn Ezra wrote this particular work. Binyamin Tadella is traveling 1165. It's roughly around the same time. Maybe Ibn Ezra is referring to a work that's produced by some of these sectarians. That's a possibility. However, there's also a second possibility that we need to explore. And this one's a little closer to home. The Rashbam, Reb Shmuel ben Meir. Reb Shmuel ben Meir is the grandson of Rashi. He's the brother of Rabbeinu Tam, the older brother of Rabbeinu Tam. Their father, Meir, married one of Rashi's daughters. Rashbam, his dates are very close to Ibn Ezra. He lives from 1080 to 1160. It's very, very close to Ibn Ezra's date. And essentially, he's a contemporary of Ibn Ezra, just living in a different place. He's living in France. Now, Rashbam's commentary is on the Chumash. Rashbam wrote a Pirush on the Chumash. This commentary on the Chumash is different from Rashi in numerous ways, but I want to say in one specific way. You know, if you were today to go online to search out, you want to see manuscripts of Rashi. What are manuscripts of Rashi? To see what it looked like, what the variations are between them. It's a very, very difficult task to do. And the reason is because, I don't know if I should say thousands, but there are definitely many, many hundreds. Definitely many hundreds of manuscripts. Rashi was a bestseller. And everyone who was doing manuscripts wanted a Rashi ala Torah, and so many manuscripts of Rashi ala Torah have survived. And yes, there are numerous differences between them, which is why it's a very interesting field to study the text of Rashi. Okay, then he had a grandson. The Rashbam also wrote a Pirush al HaTorah. This has a little bit of a different fate. Today, right now, there are 0 manuscripts of the Rashbam al HaTorah, not even one. If you go back to the early 18th century, there was one. By the time we come to the year 1705, there's one surviving manuscript of Rashbam that was in the collection of a rabbi named David Oppenheim. He was a rabbi in Prague, other places as well, and he had a very impressive collection of books. And he had one ksav yad of Pirush Rashbam al HaTorah, which he allowed to be published from his collection in the year 1705. This manuscript was looted and destroyed during World War II. from the rabbinical seminary in Breslau. And that's why we have 0 manuscripts today. Another important factor, Rashi is quoted by everyone immediately after Rashi's generation. Everyone is quoting him. It takes a few decades, and the Sfardim are also quoting him. Everyone's quoting Rashi. Rashbam's Pirush is quoted very, very little by other Gedolei Yisrael throughout the generations. That correlates with the fact that there aren't a lot of manuscripts, with the fact that it wasn't quoted all that often. In other words, it didn't get so much attention. Perhaps what we see today will be one explanation for why. Now, in 1705, this commentary of the Rashbam is published for the first time. However, it begins in Parshas Vayera. The reason it begins in Parshas Vayera is because that particular manuscript only, the first few pages. What are the first pages that go from a book? Usually the first ones and the last ones. And so the earlier pages from Bereshis and Noach and Lech Lecha's commentary to the Torah was not there, and so it wasn't published. And that's why if you open the typical Mikrois Gedolos, at least those that were published up until a few years ago, you will see that there's no Rashbam in Bereshis and Noach and Lech Lecha, starts with Vayera, and that's because the edition that was published in 1705 is what was moved into the Mikrois Gedolos. However, in 1882, there was a Jew by the name of David Rosen, and he issued a second edition of the Rashbam, which included everything the 1705 edition had, but he also included material for Bereshis, Noach, and Lech Lecha. How did he do it? He did it in 2 ways. One thing that he did was that he examined commentaries of the Rashbam in other places, other works. Maybe there's other works of Nevi'im and Ksuvim, and other places, and anytime he saw the Rashbam referring to a Pirush of the Pasuk, so he figured, so that the Rashbam is referencing a Pirush in Parshas Noach, so let's bring that in over here. So that's one thing that he did. Another thing that he did is he found another manuscript. The manuscript was Rashbam just for Bereshis Perek Aleph. And so that he found, that he had, and that he published, so now he published a new edition of the work in the year 1882. So because of that edition, we have the following passage that we're now going to read in Bereshis Perek Aleph, Pasuk Ches, on the Pasuk, Vayihi Erev, Vayihi Boiker. Let me just remind you, the Chazal, numerous occasions, use this pasuk to derive the system of our calendar, that the halachic day begins at night. Vayi Erev, first, Vayi Boiker, second, and when you conclude that cycle and day is over, then Yom Echad, that's when you have the end of the halachic day. Says Rashbam, Vayi Erev, Sheheriv Yom Rishon V'shika Or. Vayi Erev means that you had the first day concluding, and you had Shkias HaChama. Vayi Boiker, Boikroi Shalayla. You had the piercing through of night, Sha'ala Amud HaShachar, that the morning light pierced through the darkness. That's what the meaning of the word Boiker is. And now that you had morning, Harei Hushlam Yoim Echad Min HaShisha Yamim. Only now that you had Vayi Erev and you had Vayi Boiker. Only now that you had Vayi Boiker, which means you could look back at yesterday and say there was a day. And there was a night. And now Vayi Boiker, there's a new day. So now I can look back and say that Hushlam Yoim Echad, one day, Min HaShisha Yomim, of the 6 days, She'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Aseres HaDirbis, which Hashem in Parshas Yisro is going to say, that you should keep Shabbos. Because Sheishas Yomim Asa Hashem, so there he's talking about 6 days. So those 6 days that he's referring to in Yisro is referring back to the 6 days that we're talking about here. And those 6 days that we're talking about here, they begin in the morning and they conclude with the ending of night in Boikrei Shalayla when you come to the next Amud HaShachar. V'achar kach Hischal Yom HaSheni, and when you have morning, then the second day begins. This is what the Rashbam says in this particular passage, which therefore allows us to suggest that maybe Ibn Ezra was not referring to these sectarians who were living in Cyprus and perhaps in some other places. Maybe he's referring to the Pirush of the Rashbam. Now it goes without saying, we all understand that the Rashbam was not suggesting over here a change to halacha. That's going to become obvious in a moment. But nonetheless, it could be Ibn Ezra felt that this was a problematic text, and this was perhaps what he saw. I don't know that we can prove one way or the other whether he's referring to some sectarian view that actually observed this papoil, or whether he's referring to this particular passage of the Rashbam. Obviously, this passage of the Rashbam raises many questions which we need to deal with, and we'll continue to deal with as we'll go on. I should just point out that in a new edition of the Mikrois Gedolos, published in 2015, I believe, by our scroll, they removed this one particular particular passage, they decided that it's just not a reliable passage, that you can't, there's no way the Rashbam could have written this type of passage. And while they included the other material from this manuscript for Bereshis chapter 1, they omitted this particular one, and this caused a little bit of an uproar because Hayatachin and a lot have been written in the world of websites and blogs and v'chulu v'chulu ve'en kama koim laharich. Okay, the Rashbam himself in Bereshis Perek Aleph Pasuk Yudalid says the following statement. It says that Hashem gave you the sun and the moon in order to for your calendar. Right? Says Rashbam l'yamim. In what way is the sun helpful for a day? So what's he supposed to say? He's supposed to say, because let's see what he says. Because a day is determined from one sunset, essentially, one nightfall, to the next nightfall. So here he's very clearly telling you, don't get carried away with what I said earlier in Bereshis Aleph Ches. What I said in Bereshis Aleph Ches was how you interpret the words Vayi Erev Vayber. You want to know what these words mean? I know Chazal told you that these words mean night comes before day. I know they said that. But I'm telling you that in Pshuto Shamikra, these words mean that day actually comes before the night. Now, if you want to know what is a day, I'll find a way a few passages later, a few psukim later, to just let you know that, by the way, I know that the day begins that Shabbos begin when you bench Licht Friday night, and that it concludes Motzei Shabbos when you make Havdalah. So he's giving you that information. His insistence over here is what is the meaning of the particular passage, Vayera Vayibayka Yom Rishon, and this is where he wants to insist and tell you that the Pshuta Shamikra of those words is not the halachic one. But again, as we continue going on, this is going to become more clear. And the reason is because if you read the Pirush Rashbam ala Torah, you'll find that this is not he's not a one-time offender. There's numerous interpretations that fall in a similar category. In fact, if you look at Shmois Perek Yud Gimel, Pasuk Tes, there is the first place in the Torah that talks about tefillin in the Parasha of Kadosh Li. And when it comes to V'hayol Ois Hayadcha, look what Rashbam writes. Lefi Oimek Pshutoi, if you want to follow the depth of Pshat, what does it mean? This means you should remember, as if you're writing it onto your hand. And he brings a pasuk of Shir HaShirim where the female tells the male in their loving relationship, Simani kechoisem ali becha, or Simeni kechoisem ali becha, put me as a seal on your heart. What does it mean when she says, I want to be a seal on your heart? What it means is, I want you to be in love with me, deeply in love with me. It doesn't literally mean that we're going to go take a wax seal and put it on the guy's heart. So when it says, what it means is that a person should be constantly remembering the Eibishter Ki'ilu as if it's written on your hand. So this is obviously an interpretation that's a shocking interpretation. It's a very indifferent interpretation, or the way we understand this, and the way Rashbam understood it himself, because Rashbam put on tefillin every day. It is noteworthy that in Parshas Va'aschanan, Rashbam does not say anything. You could go two ways here. Either you could go, why does he need to say anything? He already told you what he thinks in Boy, and so therefore he doesn't need to repeat it. Or it is possible to say that, remember, Parshas Boy is before Matan Torah. And you have these words where you have maybe what he's trying to say, Rashbam, is that at that moment, before Matan Torah, when Hashem said, you should be a sign on my hand, I should be a sign on your hand, what he was meaning there was in a metaphoric sense. So I'm not entirely sure which way, but either way, here we have a second example of an interpretation of a pasuk that is definitely against what Chazal, and he tells you this is Oimek Pshutai, and it definitely is contrary to what Chazal is, what halach is, and what halachic practices. Let's do another example. When it comes to Yom Kippur and the avodah of Yom Kippur, so one of the things the Torah says is there was one of the animals were sent la'azazal hamidbara. Says the Rashbam in Vayikra Perek Tezayin as follows. Lefi Pshutai, what is this sending of the animal to La'azaz al-Amidbara? L'shalach ha'seichai, he goes alive. Elaharim asher ba'midbar, to go living at the hills that are in the desert. Just like we see by Tzipoida Mitzayra. And part of the purification process of the Mitzayra, the pasuk says, V'shilach es hatzipar achaya pnei asad, they have to send away one of the birds. The bird isn't killed, the bird isn't pushed off anything or harmed in any way. Afkan, so too, and that is a process of purification. Well, guess what? Here, Yom Kippur is L'Taris Yisrael Me'avonosam. So you Mashach El HaMidbar, you do the same thing. It's the same idea. It's a purification process. You send the animal to the Midbar, and by the way, he's going to meet his buddies there. That's where other animals are there. Indeed, you see by Yisroi that Yisroi took his sign, Achar HaMidbar. In other words, shepherds bring their flock into the desert. In terms of the water issue, I'm not entirely sure how to address that. But he thinks that this is a normal place to bring an animal, a normal place to send an animal, and this is what you were doing. You were sending an animal to his buddies. This is obviously very different from Chazal's description, where Chazal say, La'azaz al-amidbar, is that the animal was thrown off the peak of a hill and ultimately died as a result of that. So that's another example. All of a sudden we start realizing the more you look at these interpretations, the Vayiyar Vayiboiker, one is not so radical anymore, and also really raises a question, was there really a need to remove that passage, given that we're starting to see a pattern over here? Let's do one more. This one I'll summarize outside. When it comes to Parshas Mishpatim, you have two passages when it comes to the Shomer. In one passage, it says a Shomer is Pater when it comes to Gneva. In another passage of Parashat Mishpatim says that the Shomer is Chayav when it comes to Gneva. So how do Chazal work that out, and how does Rashi explain it? He says very different, very, very simple. It's the difference between a Shomer Chinam and a Shomer Sachar. If it's a Shomer Chinam, he's Pater if it's Gneva. And if it's a Shomer Sachar, who's getting paid for his work, so he has a higher status of security that he has to do because he's getting paid, and so therefore he's Chayav when it comes to Gneva. Says Rashbam says, I know what Rabbi Seinu say. Pirsha Rabbi Seinu, Rishoina is Shomer Chinam, and the second one is Shomer Sachar. Guess what? Lefi Pshotei Shal Mikra, I'm going to tell you something else. And he goes on to say, both could be talking about a Shomer Chinam, both could be talking about a Shomer Sachar. That's not relevant. The relevant factor is as follows. Where the difference is, if you look at the text, you'll see, one, the case of Pater is talking about a Chayfetz Kalim, and the case of Chayev is talking about an animal. So he says that's the key difference. In the case of Pater, the reason is Pater B'Gneva is because you gave a watch to your friend to keep. He's supposed to watch it. What did he do? He put it in his drawer together with his jewelry. That's a very nice standard of Shmira. That's what I expected. That's what you expect. Shmira is a contract, right? It's a contract. There's a haskama between two people. I gave you my watch. I'm giving you my watch to guard, and I assume that you're going to put it together with your watches. Good. So you kept your side of the contract by putting it with your watches, and so therefore you're Pater if it gets stolen, and that's why that passage says Pater. However, the passage that says Chayiv is talking about an animal. Clearly in the text it says it's talking about an animal. And so therefore he says, well, what's the contract with an animal? When I know, if I'm giving you my animal, I know you need to take it out, you need to take it for a walk, you need to take it to feed, to graze, you need to take it out for water. These are all things that you need to do with the animal. And so I know that it's a dangerous situation. And so I'm like, in my head, I know you're doing dangerous, it's a dangerous situation. Ganovim could come to the field and take it. Obviously, you're going to hire 6 armed guards to guard the animals when you're doing this. And you, who agreed to be the shomer, you also understood that. And that was our contract. And because that was our contract, when you didn't do that, that's why you're chayiv. So this is how he understands the difference between these two particular passages. Again, very different. And he says, I know what Chazal say, and here I'm giving you what the Pshut Shal Mikra is. There are other examples, but these are the 4 that stand out. Vayira Vayiboiker, the Tefillin passage, the Seir La'azazel, and the passage of the Shomer Chinam and the Shomer Sachar. So what is going on over here? What is happening over here? Now perhaps you may have encountered a Rashi where the Rashi is not consistent with halacha, but none of them come close to this. In fact, usually, I'm not the biggest buck in this, I didn't study this closely. Usually when Rashi is not on halacha is when there's a machloikas tanoim, and he goes with one side of the machloikas, which works out more in Pshut Shal Mikra, even though the halacha is like the other side. Usually it's like that. There's nothing close that comes to these 4 examples in any of Rashi's interpretation. So therefore we are actually seeing something very radical here that we need to understand what's happening. So the good thing is that Rashbam wrote a hakdama to his work. In fact, he wrote 3 hakdamas. It's a little confusing why he did this 3 separate times. The first hakdama he wrote is the Parshas Bereshis, right in the beginning. We're not going to read from there. But because anything he says there, he said in a later passage that we're going to read, and that's in Parshas Vayeshev. It's not clear why he, Ki'ilu, starts writing a second Hagdama in Parshas Vayeshev, and a third one is right before Mishpatim. Mishpatim, you get a feeling, because there's so many drashas Chazal, including the one we just learned about Shomer Chinam and Shomer Sachar, and he's going against it, so he restates his theory. So let's read his theory the way it appears in Parshas Vayeshev, a very interesting passage. He says as follows: Yaskilu v'yavinu oyevei seichel. If you love seichel, you will understand. Masha limdunu rabbeinu, what our teachers taught us. Ki ein mikra yosem midei pshutai. The Gemara says that a pasuk can never leave its pshutai, its most basic meaning. Af ki ikra shel Torah ba lelamdeinu u'lahidiyenu b'remizas hapshat ha'agados v'halachos v'hadinin. Let's stop there. Although the ikar of Torah, there's something called pshat, and ein mikra yotzei midei pshuta. You can never walk away fully from pshat, but that's not the ikar of Torah. The ikar of Torah is to teach us and to let us know through remazim the agadata, the halachas, and the dinim. Okay, we're going to call that medrash. Medrash is a term. The ikar of Torah is medrash. And how does medrash work? Because the Torah is written idei arichas halashon, because sometimes the text is a little longer than it needs to be, and there's shloshim mishtayim midrash Rabbi Elazar b'nei Rabbi Yisrael Glili. We have 32 midos of how to learn from an extra word or from other things that follow these 32 rules, and then there's the 13 midos shel Rabbi Yishmael Kal v'chomer Gzeira Shava, and all these are the different mechanisms that Chazal use for medrash. And that is the ikar of Torah. In fact, the earlier ones, he says before our time, their main focus was on medrash. Why? I already told you, shein ikar. And therefore, they weren't so concerned with the oimek, maybe a basic level of pshuta shomikra they were aware of, but the oimek pshuta shomikra they were not. Where do I see that they were not so aware? He quotes the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Samach Gimel, where Rav Kana says that I was 18 years old and I had learned Kula Talmuda, the law Havayadana, but I didn't know the Mikra Yesim de Pshutai. How's it possible that he didn't know Mikra Yesim de Pshutai? How's it possible he didn't understand that idea that you can't walk away from the Pshat? Because the Rishonim, he's calling what we call Tanoim and Amoraim, he's calling them Rishonim, they focused on the Ikar. Why? His Lashon is Mitoich Chasidusa, piety. It's interesting. In other words, if you're a real pious person, you're running after the ikar of Torah, which is what medrash is. Okay? And that's why Rav Kana was so focused on medrash that he wasn't really involved in pshat. Ad kadei kach, he didn't know, when he reached 18, he didn't know mikra yosem de pshuta. However, I'm going to be writing pshat. And you have to ask why. Like, if the ideal, chasidusam, if it's more pious to be involved in medrash, then why are we doing pshat? He doesn't tell us that. So, you can say this, you can say that. The bottom line is, this is what he does. Then he adds the following interesting passage. V'gam Rabbeinu Shlomo. What about your grandfather? Okay, you're saying, we need pshat, 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 pshat. Rashi says, "Ein mikra yosem midei pshutai." Rashi claims that as the mandate for his work. So he has to address that. So he says, "V'gam Rabbeinu Shlomo avi imi meir einei goyla." He able to see that the term meir einei goyla was used during this period for all the great rabbis. It wasn't only used for Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGoyla, but Rashi here is called Meir Einei Goyla as well. Okay, so Rashi, Shapirish, Torah Nevi'im Uksuvim, he wrote a Pirush on Tanakh. Nasan Leiv, the Farish Shuta Shomikra. I think the way to interpret this is he dedicated time, or he attempted to explain the Tanakh according to Pshuta Shomikra. Va'afani Shmuel bar Meir Chasnei Zatzal. However, I, Shmuel, the son of Meir was his son-in-law, Rashi's son-in-law, Nisvakachti imoi. I argued with him, with Rashi. Ulufanov, in his presence. Rashbam was born, we said earlier in the year 1080. Rashi is said to have passed away around the year 1105. So he would have been about 25 years old when his grandfather passed away. So this conversation would have happened, I don't know, sometime between when he was 15 and 25, something like that. V'hoidali, and Rashi agreed, if he would have had the time, indeed Rashi says if he would have had the time, he would have had to have made new interpretations or other alternative interpretations of Pshuta Shomikra. In other words, that he didn't do a good enough job. Lafi hapshatais, I think that's the way to read that word, hapshatais. I don't think it's hapashtos. I think it's hapshatos hamischachim b'chol yoim. According to the new understandings in Pshat that are constant. What does that mean by that are constant b'chol yoim? I think what he means here is the Rash doesn't grow. You can't make a new Gzeira Shava. You can't make a new Binyan Av. That era, right? We don't find Rishonim doing that. That era was over. The cutoff was the Tanoim, whether the cutoff was Smicha, whether the cutoff was the Amarayim, it's a separate conversation. But that's not Mischadish B'chol Yoim, that's pretty much closed. But when it comes to Pshat is how you understand the Pshat today, and then there's maybe in 50 years from now, I'll understand the Pshat differently, even though there's a part of my brain that says it shouldn't work that way, because Pshat is Pshat is Pshat is Pshat. Simple meaning of the words, when I say, get me a drink of water, the Pshat of that shouldn't have interpretations that keep on expanding and growing throughout the generations. But I don't know whether it's because there's new understandings or whether it's because Torah is bli gvul. Somehow there is the concept of the Pshates HaMischachim B'chol Yom, and here it's not closed off in a way where we say that you can't continue adding, and so therefore, and I told this to Rashi, and Rashi agreed with me, and he's like, something really, if I had the time, I don't have the time. If I had the time, I would write another Pirush. This is, I don't think we doubt that the story happened. The Rashbam says he had this conversation with Rashi, but the question is, what did Rashi really mean when he said those words? Was Rashi issuing a stamp of disapproval on his own work? It's hard to or was Rashi saying, something, I'm the one in my commentary that wrote, from the only ones who write, Lo Yadaiti and Lo Yadaiti, so I know a thing or two about humility, and it's not a perfect pirush. It's not a perfect pirush. So you're telling me it's not perfect, Rashbam? Okay, if I had time, I'd work on it more, right? It's like there's two radically different ways of understanding what Rashi would have meant over here. Again, okay, you're right. Disapproval of my work. Indeed, we should put it aside and we should issue a new work, which is what Rashbam is doing, because Rashbam is using this as the mandate to create his pirush on Pshuta Shel Mikra, or Rashi just saying, you could find a gap in anything, including in my work, and so therefore, if I had time, I'd close some of those gaps. But the bottom line is, Rashbam, we see over here that the four radical interpretations that we saw before about Sir Lazazel and about Tefillin and about the Shem Rechinam and Shem Resachar, about Vayiyah and Vayibayker, those aren't random. In other words, he had a different perception of what Pshuta Shel Mikra means, which led him to a place that Rashi didn't go. And he wanted to go there, and he did go there. In the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, he reiterates this point, and he says the following. Yedu v'yavinu yedi seichel. Again, he's appealing to those with knowledge. Ki lo yivasi lefarash halachas. I am not here to tell you what the halacha is. Afal pi she'em ikr. Again, halachas and drashas, medrash, that's the ikr. But I'm not here to do that. Miyusar hamikrois nishmayin ha'agadas halachas. From the extra psukim and the extra words in psukim, that's how we're able to derive the agadata and the halachas. And by the way, if you're interested in a work that does halacha and agadata, I think this is to use in the Yiddish word, a shtickle shtech to his grandfather. Umiksas on some of these agadatas and halachas yimtzu b'pirushay rabbein. You'll find up on my grandfather. You want halacha and medrash, you go to Rashi for that. You want pshuta shel mikra, ani lefarish pshuta shel mikra is basi. I came for pshuta shel mikra. So he's here defining Rashi as a work of medrash, as a work of halacha. The irony of that should not be lost on this. Okay, so. In sum, really, you can spend a lot of time on this, but we're not going to spend too much time on this. What's happening over here? Essentially, we're learning, the Rashbam is teaching us that there are multiple layers of Torah. There's the layer of Torah, which is the Ikar of Torah, which is when the Chachamim derive through the 32 methods, the 13 methods, whichever method it is, and they derive a meaning to the pasuk, which may not be the Pshuta Shel Mikra. And that's the main thing, that's the Iker. And that's what we need to follow, and that's what we do follow. And indeed, he hinted to you even in Bereshis Parak Aleph that the halachic day begins at night and ends at night. However, for some reason, there's an alternative track. And it's important to him that there be this alternative track of Pshuta Shel Mikra. And this alternative track of Pshuta Shel Mikra is to the extreme of having interpretations of these very psukim that are in contradiction, essentially, to these. Now, I understand the value of Pshuto Shel Mikra when it comes to say, okay, I know when Avraham said this to Sarah, the Medrash says is this, but Pshuto Shel Mikra he only meant that. I understand the value of that, and I appreciate that. Generally, the idea that there's multiple layers of Torah, I get that. It's a little harder for me to wrap my brain around the value of having one level telling you Seir La'azazel means send it alive, send it down a hill. Right? Oh, and by the way, there's another meaning, which we don't follow, but you should know that there is this other meaning to the text at Pshuto Shel Mikra, which is send it out alive, which contradicts what's the value of having that second meaning? In fact, let me say it this way. The Tefillin passage, if you think about it, is actually not so radical. Even if you don't accept that maybe he meant only before Matan Torah. Why? Because it doesn't contradict Tefillin. It just says this pasuk means God should be bound on your heart. And indeed it should be. It's a good thing. I see value in seeing the pasuk. One layer meaning is that you should have God on your mind and heart, or every minute of the day, every hour of the day. I get that. That's meaningful. Oh, and by the way, there's another thing. You should put on tefillin. I think the two could work together. So it's not, but how does it work together that the seh goes out la'azazel and the midbar stays alive, but it also doesn't stay alive? Or vayera vayaboiker, the day starts in the morning or it starts at night at the same time. Here, the parallel tracks. How is one giving me, how is Rashbam's alternatives giving me anything of use? That's a little harder to understand, but at the end of the day, Torah is multifaceted and there's multiple layers and multiple tracks. The Rashbam definitely felt that there was this Pshuto Shel Mikra track. He's following in Rashi's footsteps, but he's taking it to places where Rashi never did it. And so therefore we come back to that passage, and we see that it pretty much fits in line with some of the other things that he did. Now, I want to transition to talk about a few other points. This Rashbam came up multiple times in the writings of the Rebbe. So number one, there was a teacher in 1945 who wrote to the Rebbe that when it comes to a particular passage in the Torah, and I don't want to get into which one, he doesn't like what Rashi says. He thinks it's harder for the kids to understand it. There's an Ibn Ezra that interprets it otherwise. So he tells his students to tie to the Ibn Ezra. People came over to him and said, Feh, how you talking? How you allowed to do that? If Rashi said it, this is what Rashi is, and you're not allowed to mess around with that. So the Rebbe responded to him. This is in Igros Kodesh Chelik Aleph, pages 99 and 100. And the Rebbe basically responded to him and saying, if you have an Ibn Ezra, there's nothing wrong with using that interpretation. Rashi said he's Pshuto Shel Mikra. Yeah, but the Rashbam reports that Rashi himself agreed that if he had time, he would write Pirushim Acherim. And so therefore, there's nothing wrong with turning to the Ibn Ezra in a place where you feel that it is appropriate. In that particular pasuk, though, the Rebbe, I think, went on to suggest that it wasn't the wisest thing, but that was a local issue that doesn't need to concern us right now. That's number one. Number two, there was this issue that happened in the early 1960s, where there was this idea that came up in Eretz Yisrael to write a new commentary to the Torah. It would be written by traditional Jews, but to really, to introduce something new, something very fresh. It seems to me that this is what became eventually the Das Mikra interpretation of the Tanakh, which was published by Moshe Harav Kook. So Rabbi Zevin was in correspondence with the Rebbe about this in the early 1960s, about whether this new commentary is a good idea. The Rebbe wrote to him, yes, but on certain conditions. One of the conditions the Rebbe wrote about was that it's important that it be Yayin Yashan and the Kankan Chadash, which means the Rebbe was trying to say that the interpretations need to be based on the interpretations from the Rishonim. The Lashon the Rebbe was starting from Rashi, ending with the commentary of the Metzudas David and the Metzudas Sion. His name is David Altshuler. He passed away around the year 1770 or so, and so it's kind of the Rebbe gave a start date and an end date for what these interpretations should be, and that's that. So Rabbi Zevin wrote back to him saying, but why are you saying that? Like, why can't we continue adding Perushim? Why is your cut off the Reb David Altshuler? So the Rebbe wrote that the response as follows. In terms of the Metzudas David and Metzudas Sion, the commentary from David Altshuler, so it's brought in Chassidus, number one. Number two, it was studied in all the traditional Cheder, and the Rebbe says an interesting line of students who ended up growing up after they left Cheder, a life that was consistent according to Torah. In other words, there are other commentaries that were written where people who studied them later when they grew up, those who adopted those commentaries didn't follow a way of Torah. I think the Rebbe is referring to here to a Chumash printed not too long after the Metzudas David and Metzudas Sion. The beer that was produced by Moses Mendelssohn and his team in Berlin, it came out in the year 1779, and I think the Rebbe didn't want any of that and the hemshech of that involved or having any influence in this new commentary. Indeed, one of the big critiques of this school was that the people who grew up in those chadarim, many of them didn't have, whether themselves or their progeny, didn't grow up in a way where they were following the Torah and the Messiah. Now, the Rebbe then addressed the question of, hold on a second, Rabbi Zevin said, Rashbam said, Pshatay Samischachem B'chol Yom. Every day there's new pshat. So what's wrong with introducing something new? So the Rebbe responded to him with the passage saying that's not true, because we have this statement in Hayom Yom, really it's an Ayin Beis, and the Rebbe quotes is actually a source attributing it to the Baal Shem Tov, that the Mechabrim until the Taz and the Shach, that's the 17th century, it's actually a little earlier than the Mesudas Zav and Mesudas Sion, but till then was with Ruach HaKodesh. So you see from there that even if you have Pshatas HaMeschachem B'chol Yom, there's Pshatas HaMeschachem B'chol Yom where it's Ruach HaKodesh, and that's one level, and then there's everything else. If we're writing a new commentary, let it be based on all of that. Not that's only Rashi, all of them. But let it be mostly based on those works and not on the works that came from later. So that's another interesting reference where this Rashbam came up. Another area where this came up was after the 6-Day War. There were those who wanted to say that we're in the state of Eschalta to Geula. The Rebbe said this is not true. Yes, the 6-Day War was a miracle. It's Toyameh Chaim Zachu. It's a taste of what will be by when Mashiach comes, but it is not Eschalta de Gula. Although it is true that we have some sources that do imply there is a slow process to the Gula, but that's contrary to the Rambam. So you're not going to follow the Medrash against the Rambam. And here the Rebbe brings us an example, this Rashbam, just like you have the Rashbam in Pshut Shomikra, but you're not going to follow it in Halacha. So to these Midrashim, where it does seem to suggest you can have a long drawn-out process of Eschalta de Gula and Lav Dafke through the person of Mashiach, etc., where the Rambam describes it, the Rebbe says, just like the Rashbam exists, it's part of Torah, it's there, but it's not something that becomes our hashkafa, so too in that area. And so this was another interesting example. Another thing is, there were times that the Rebbe spoke about the fact, there's once an instance in Tafshim Memhei, where the Rebbe interpreted a Rashi differently from how he interpreted in earlier years. So Lecha, Vayerech, I saw those parshas. So they asked, why are you offering this new interpretation? You already offered a prior one. And the Rebbe basically cited this Rashbam and said, no problem. Rashi himself said, Pshata is Hamischachem B'chol Yom, and so therefore I could have explained this Rashi in one way 5 years ago, and we could explain it in a different way today. That was Rashi saying it. Rashi said. So who am I to say I'm going to do it? Yeah, I could do it too, because if we hear a story of a Gadol B'Yisrael, him saying that about himself, so it means it's a lesson for us that we too can offer a new reading in Rashi. Well, another point related to this is that Rashi multiple times says Lo Yadaiti, I don't know. So Rebbe's Medaik, it doesn't say Lo Yadua, it's not known, because Rashi can't say it's not known. And the reason is because there has to be a beer and pshat for every single word of the Torah. Rashi himself says, I don't know. But someone else will come along later and we'll figure it out. And the Rebbe quoted this Rashbam, where it pointed out that yes, there's multiple layers of pshat. Rashi himself said if he had time, he'd do more pshat. And so therefore we, as midgets standing on the shoulders of giants, are able to then immerse ourselves in this and hopefully discover what that pshat is. But this is a little bit of an overview of this issue of Vayihi Erev Vayihi Boker, as it turns out in this Igeras HaShabbos that we started the class with. And I want to conclude now with what we began with. And we began with the theme of Afar, and the Afar being at first on bottom, being trampled upon, but then the Jewish people rising out and being on top. And indeed, this very much connects to the theme of Vayihi Erev Vayihi Boker. There's a mimer from the Mittel Rebbe in Imre Bina, Pesach Hashar, Perek Tes, and this will take a few minutes for us to go through this, and then we'll conclude. The Mittel Rebbe says as follows. The Pasuk says, Vayerev Vayiboker Yom Echad, which means in halacha that you cannot have a day without having an evening preceding it. The question is, why must it be that a day has to include both evening and morning? Why can't you have it separately? We can have 14 days a week. Night, day, night, and completely separate. And why is it that dafka the Laila comes first? So it's two questions. Again, why do we insist that there's 7 days, each consisting of day and night? And why do we want that dafka the night is first? So the Rebbe explains. Where does the story of creation begin? The story of creation begins with the tzimtzum. What's the tzimtzum? The concealment. That's a moment of darkness. That's choshech koydem la'or. In other words, the narrative of the entire creation is darkness first and then light after. After the tzimtzum, then God was chazav re'er, and then He issued a new light. And this becomes the pattern throughout the entire Seder Ishtalshalos down to our world, that you're always going to have night preceding darkness, including in this physical world. And this is why we see, this night preceding day. And this is why we see, even in Mili de Alma, that a person can have an aliyah, whether it's financial, or whether it's in stature, or whether it's about a family, or any other success. For example, in learning. The only way to achieve these successes is through going through the contrary first. That's the shiflus, and the tsar, and the nezek, ukahai gavna. And he says, when a person is learning, your learning is not going to come easy to you. You're going to have to learn. You're going to have to harav alat. You have to have tsar benafshoy until you feel even like yiush, that I'm never going to understand it. Indeed, the Gemara in Gittin Daf Mem Gimel says that you can't find the halacha without making a mistake in the matter first. And so too in the financial sphere, we see that it is impossible to be successful in making a living without Yegias HaNefesh and without Tsar Rav, until a person mamish reaches a breaking point. Then a person finds his bracha. And so too in the very structure of business. A person has to invest a lot of money. That's darkness. Investment means you're parting with money in order to make a lot more. What do you see? Darkness before light. Why is this? Because this is the pattern that starts all the way from the tzimtzum, where the darkness precedes the light. You cannot have light without the darkness before, and that's the teaching of the sages, Lefum Tzara Agra, that in accordance with the pain is going to be the gain and the reward. This answers his questions. Why is it that night precedes the day? Obviously, because that's what life is. All of life is where darkness precedes light. And it starts all the way from the tzimtzum in that way. And that's why we insist, by the way, that it's one unit. If you would have 14 days in a week, night, day, as separate units, then you're saying that each one's independent. No, darkness is not independent. Darkness has no standalone value. Darkness is only there as a achana for light. So in order to convey that message, we need to have it one day with the darkness leading into light, which reminds us that as we go about our lives and we face those difficult moments, that's not an end. That's not the end of the story. That is step 1 leading to step 2, which is the great find that we're going to have in all of those examples. This I'm connecting, with your permission, to the concept of ahaya zaracha ka'afar aretz. That although at times we feel that they're treading upon us and that they have their boots on our neck and that we're under them, at the end of the day, that's the darkness that precedes the light. And the light that's going to be at the end is that Am Yisrael is going to be on top, and may we see that very soon, B'karav Mamish.